Hello there. Thanks for joining us. My name is Matthew Orr. I'm a Eurasia analyst at RANE. I'm joined here by my colleague, Roger Baker, and we are going to discuss some of the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, what's each side's strategy, kind of the trajectory of where things are headed in this conflict, and potentially what are the elements of the war that the two sides might be poorly calculating when they're thinking about their strategy and their next steps and the possibilities of any negotiations. We're lucky, Roger, because we do have kind of a trigger for our discussion today. We have Putin in televised remarks yesterday told members of the Russian parliament that Russia's war was really just getting started, and that they presumably that Russia was willing to take the conflict to a much further level. That that this would be a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, and it seemed clear that he was trying to force some dialogue with the West, or some negotiation with the West. The problem is that the way it looks to me, it doesn't look like there's a lot of desire in the West at this point to really start this negotiation on terms that are acceptable to Putin. And so it's pretty clear that at least for the coming months, we're going to be on the same trajectory. And so I guess the question I would have for you is how do you think about kind of the two sides strategy at this point?
Right. Well, I mean, when I look at this, first of all, I think that we have to think about this not as two sides, but as at least three sides and possibly four. And that is, there is Russia and Ukraine, who are the direct belligerents. And then there's the United States and Europe, who are secondary belligerents within the conflict. And the US and the Europeans have the ability to shape the outcome in many ways of this conflict by what they choose to give or not give to the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah.
And so we have to think of this in a multi-vectored way. And I think that when you look at Putin's comments, he put those comments about continuing the war and negotiation should happen now, and if they don't, they're going to be worse later, in the context of his repeated assertion that this conflict was actually triggered by the West, right? He pushed it back to the 2014 to actions by what he sees as effectively the Western coup to overthrow the Ukrainian government, and then pulled that forward into this discussion. And so when we look at this, I think that Putin is in some ways talking to a very real concern that the Western leaders have. Let's separate Ukraine out of here for a moment and push out to the Americans and the Europeans. They're looking at this conflict, looking at the cost of weapon systems being sent in and the reduction of their own stockpiles by sending them in. They're looking at the reconstruction cost, which numbers are coming around in the billions already, and we can anticipate that potentially getting larger the longer the conflict goes on. So there's the input costs. They're looking at the way in which this conflict has impacted commodities. So food commodities, energy commodities, and pricing, which is impacting the inflation dynamics and the social dynamics domestically in the West. And then they're looking at the question of how far do they push the conflict? How much do they give the Ukrainians? Because if they provide the Ukrainians with too much capability, then Ukraine is able to push Russia back potentially, and maybe even strike into Russia. And you now get into the very high potential of Russia shifting this from a Russia-Ukraine conflict to a Russia-NATO conflict. So the West is concerned with that. And then at the same time, they've shaped this all in the concept of the protection of democracy against evil autocracy. And so politically, they can't back down. But when we watch militarily, they're constraining the Ukrainians' capability. And that means that in some ways, we can anticipate that the West is quietly discussing with the Ukrainians where is a proper point to stop. Even if we don't publicly accept that Russia has taken this territory, there has to be a moment of pause. It's not clear that the Ukrainians, for example, can survive a war of attrition any better than the Russians can.
Right, absolutely. And so when I think about this, what I think the conflict that you're getting at when you talk about how it's not two sides, it's really three or four, is that there seems to be a possible disconnect between what the Ukrainians think the strategy is, and of course what the West thinks the strategy is, because the Ukrainians are talking all the time about how they're going to free large pieces of their territory. Of course, rhetorically, they claim that they're going to retake the Donbass, etc. But I think it's pretty clear to me that once Russia occupies the Donbass, that area is really what the Russians want to hold on to most, and that's not going to be even on the table for them in negotiations. And the Ukrainians still have to show a capability to retake these other areas of Ukraine. And of course, we're not talking about even talking about Crimea. And so there's this big disconnect between what the Ukrainians are saying their goals of this are, and I think this understanding that's developing in the West that Ukraine is not going to get its claimed international borders back in the foreseeable future, certainly. But this is important because Western support, as you said, is premised on what are we actually trying to achieve. And so I mean, it seems to me that the West has already kind of set this limit. But the one area that I think things could change is, if we're going to see these longer range rockets given to the HIMARS artillery, that's definitely one to look out for. In terms of others, I don't know. I'm not sure that there are other weapon systems that the West would give that they haven't already. It's clear that fighter jets are off the table, but I mean, I don't think that Ukraine needs totally different systems from what they're already getting. It's just clear that they would need more of them if they were going to really consider a major counterattack.
Well, I mean, I think when you talk about the goals of the West and the goals of the Ukrainian government, I think it's easy to understand the goals of the Russians. It's easy to understand clearly the goals of the Ukrainians, which is the complete independence of their country.
Yeah.
The West, I don't think, has fully and effectively defined its goals. And this is a challenge of Western democracies for a very long time, is defining the end goals of conflicts that they become involved in, because they're tied up in so many different subcategories, right? So from the West perspective, certainly in an ideal world, Russia would completely withdraw from Ukraine. It's not clear that the West is willing to pay the cost of pushing Russia out of Ukraine. As a matter of fact, I think it is clear that they're not willing to pay that cost. Therefore, the West has to redefine its goals. But politically, it's indefensible politically to say we don't support Ukrainian independence.
Right.
So the West is tied up in a very mixed messaging where there's social pressure to keep funding Ukraine and supplying weapons, and complaints if governments don't go far enough. There's equal social pressure for the inflationary costs and the disruptive costs and getting dragged into a conflict with Russia. And there's no clear end goal for the West other than that maybe west of the Dnieper River needs to stay Ukraine, and that Ukraine needs to keep some access to the Black Sea, and that the West can't allow the Russians to control the entire Black Sea border.
Right. Right. But even I think that sounds about right. I think it's important to point out here, though, that Russia retaining control of the land corridor to Crimea that runs along the eastern, or what's called the left bank of the Dnieper, is still strategically absolutely devastating for the Ukrainian state. Strategically, Russia's control of one side of the mouth of the river means that they essentially can then control all commerce up and down the river, which is really the economic, lifeblood. I mean, it's economically, ideologically so crucial to Ukraine, and Russia controlling one of its banks is already devastating. And so, and militarily, if Russia withdraws to the other side of the river, that's an extremely easily defensible border that I don't think the Ukrainians could realistically conduct a counterattack across. So I think that but again, that's all even premised on Ukraine doing a successful counterattack towards Kherson. I want to ask you, I really like what you said about kind of the elements of Russia's strategy, and let's talk about Russia's strategy for a second. The kind of question that I've been mulling over so much recently, and I hope to be publishing a piece on shortly, is whether or not Russia's strategy is going to work. It's clearly settling in for this very long-term battle with the West, and that's another thing that was very clear in Putin's remarks yesterday. That Russia thinks that it's changing the world order, and it thinks that these long-term economic changes that are taking place are essentially going to work in its favor, and that the Western right, you have Russia, this big economy. It's a huge commodity producer, grain, all these critical things. Once if the global economy, the West is in recession, it's going to lead up to a lot of pressure to in the isolation of Russia. And of course, Russia thinks that you can't really isolate our economy. There had been kind of this misperception in the West that because in terms of people would look at nominal GDP numbers and say, oh, Russia's down there with Italy and Spain, is not that big of an economy. And there was this, and right, not looking at purchasing power parity. And there was this constantly kind of under appreciation of the role that Russia plays in the economy, because a lot of these metrics, use overbloat the importance of the service sector. Russia is an economy that's, produces commodities and things that the world really needs. And so I think that, we'll see. I guess my question for you is, what do you think about the long-term viability of Russia's strategy? Do you think economic chaos in the West is possible, farther out, say, this winter? And is that enough to really change to get the West back to the negotiating table?
I would say that what Russia is betting on is not necessarily that they are changing the world order, but they're betting on the idea that the world order is changing anyway, and this gives them greater space to break out of the Western defined order. That the path to multipolarism is already well underway. The Russians don't have to do anything to force or create that new path, and therefore they see opportunity and reduced risk in securing their Western flank in the way they see it and what they're doing in Ukraine. So Ukraine is a piece of this, right? They had the political accommodation with Belarus, so they didn't need that action. They still have the ability to exert negative influence in places like Georgia, although there's some questions further into the Caucasus and in Turkish influence pushing into there. The Balts are still off the table for them, and they're unlikely to be able to reclaim that, and the Black Sea is becoming, or the Baltic Sea is becoming a major challenge for them. But Ukraine is this key bastion that they must secure that space, and then they can look and see that, as Putin laid out, even U.S. allies are not necessarily on board with the complete isolation of Russia, and certainly middle powers are not. So the Indonesians were recently in Moscow to talk about movement of food and fuel, and they invited Lavrov to the G20 ministerial summit that's taking place now. The Cambodians have said for ASEAN that for the upcoming ASEAN Regional Forum, the Russians are still invited. They're not being isolated from that. India, well, they've made some limitations. It's continued economic connectivity with Russia, and the West can't just block the Indians and knock them out, because they need them for all sorts of other things. So I think what the Russians are seeing is there is space. Is this going to be challenging for Russia? Certainly. Some of the big issues that have been raised in already are: does Russia have access to the technology that it needs to further develop its mineral and energy resources for export? Is Asia, the broader Asia Indo-Pacific region, able to absorb the quantity of Russian exports that the Europeans did prior to this, in addition to what the Asians are already absorbing? So there are some challenges, I think, for the Russians, but in the most part, what I would argue is they're rushing ahead in their attempt to adapt or exploit multipolarism, more so than they're trying to create the world that will ultimately lead to a multipolar system.
Yeah, I totally agree with those points, and that's a lot of the talk immediately after the invasion was that a lot of these middle powers, they welcome the multipolar world, but they think maybe Russia rushed a little bit of this, or they're trying to bring about this multipolar world a little bit too soon than they wanted. I mean, but I think it's also important to point out that some of the powers that would potentially support the multipolar world, that they are also worried about the precedents that Russia is setting in the way that Russia is going about this, and they don't like that Russia is trying to tie this massive invasion and likely annexation to the kind of branding of this. One of the powers that comes to mind is India, that looks at annexation of neighboring territories and says, well, hold on, what kind of precedent is this setting for us and our relations vis-a-vis China, others, etc. I'm sure that there are other examples, but I'm definitely looking out to see, in which countries do we see these shades bad, in certain directions.
I have a question for you as you've been watching this. What are the stresses inside Ukraine? Because it's easy, we can talk about the Russians and the West. Ukraine is an actor here. Ukraine has its own goals. The Ukrainian leadership has been very good at exploiting social sentiment in the West to shape the political actions of the West, at least up to this point. I think that the efficacy is starting to fade. The sort of intense excitement around war and conflict is going down. The longer it goes, the more the Western societies start to forget it, or don't think of it as major. What are the aspects inside the Ukrainian leadership that will ultimately shape their decision on when they're going to say enough is enough, we've got to sue for peace, even if we don't accept this as a permanent solution, even if we put in a DMZ, inner Korean style permanent division, but not formally recognized type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think it's clear that politically there's no it's still essentially a taboo within the Zelensky administration, and really now most of the country to talk about formally recognizing Russia's annexation of new territories. And so there's the country is arguably the most united it's ever been in that respect, because remember, Zelensky's core electorate prior to his election was a lot of these Eastern Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, a lot of these people who would have been slightly more supportive of some sort of diplomatic accommodation of Russia vis-a-vis Crimea and the Donbass. Now a lot of those people are behind the Ukrainian government, behind Zelensky. And so, I mean, it's not really clear how much maneuver Zelensky has politically, because there's just no appetite to recognize these loss of territories. So what that really means is that it's all going to rely on Russia just dealing such casualties to the Ukrainians that only due to the sheer destruction and loss of people, that the logic becomes, well, we actually can't, if we continue resisting, then they're going to come on Kiev again. Then they're going to try to take much more of the country than what they already occupy. And so
I think you don't have the Ukrainians don't have to recognize it. You can move into an armistice, for example. This is how the Korean War ended. Neither side recognized the legitimacy of the other, but the active conflict was over, and it led to a perpetual issue that until they were both let into the UN, countries only recognized one ownership or the other. The UN joint membership ultimately changed that. But I think that there is, as you talk about, what's the length, how much pain can Ukraine absorb before that happens? Or are there concerns that, for example, the willingness of the West will ultimately run out and Ukraine needs to make some sort of semi-permanent temporary solution in that space?
Yeah, I mean, that's the concern, and objectively it is. The Ukrainians understand that the second the Western ammunition stops flooding in, it's over. I mean, then this whole conversation of, okay, well, the Russians can come on Kiev again, that all resumes. So yeah, in Ukraine, it definitely is this clear understanding that they are essentially beholden to the West, because these deliveries are the only thing preventing a catastrophic defeat and loss of territory. But in terms of the how, I mean, I don't see signs that really looks likely at all at this point. So we haven't, I think but this conversation is the one that we are going to be having in this winter once a lot of these dynamics have become clearer to both sides, and particularly in Ukraine. Zelensky, he still keeps giving these short time horizons. So it's like, he'll say, 3 months from now we'll be in the counterattack. And 6 months from now, his new thing is that the war should be over by the end of this calendar year. Um, I don't think that the war will necessarily be over by the end of this calendar year. I think it's pretty unlikely. But he keeps saying that it's going to be over, and at some point you get this sense that the Ukrainian that you can only cry wolf so many times, and the Ukrainians are going to say, well, is this really worth it for us, right? Why shouldn't we start the reconstruction of the places that we still own, and leave these places occupied by Russia, kind of let them go?
And we don't have time anymore today, but I think a great thing to look at in a next discussion would be to then say, what's the role of the Ukrainian diaspora in this process, right? Those who have gone out intentionally only temporarily, some who are now starting to say, well, what's the length of time do we stay? What's their political role in whether or not Ukraine ultimately has to find a position, and how long some of these, especially the European nations, are willing to keep giving that support to that diaspora, and how that may end up playing into this issue as well.
I agree. That's a fascinating question, because we have to remember that literally millions, something like 8 million Ukrainians have left. I mean, that's a very big population, and if those people stay in Europe, it's clear that they're going to be a politically salient, essentially electorate. They might not, be voting in these countries where a lot of them go, but I mean, their views are going to be loud and clear in Western and European capitals, no matter what. Well, I think we can leave it there for today, Roger. Obviously, so many aspects of this that you can just pull threads to pull on, as long as you would like. But we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us.